patrolling the city when a call came over the air. Squad 126, report to 924 North 25th Street and investigate a head in the refrigerator.
When police returned to arrest the man, there was a struggle, and the uniformed police officers made the horrific discovery: dismembered human remains, decapitated heads in a refrigerator freezer, limbs and male genitals in other containers, and a large barrel full of acid. Experienced homicide detectives say the killings have a sexual component. The male victims allegedly killed by a 31-year-old man, Jeffrey Dahmer. Apparently, cannibalism is an element in this case.
Could be your next-door neighbor, that nice person next door. You would never suspect them of doing this sort of thing.
To these men, 10 minutes of pleasure is worth more than the other person's life.
We know they don't stop killing because they have reached a quota and they don't want to kill anymore. This is something they have to do.
These are human beings whose only way of relating to another human being is through dominating, terrorizing, humiliating, and dispatching them. These are, to use the scientific word, scum.
The compulsions that drive the serial killer have been the subject of major studies by investigators, scientists, and psychiatrists. Is it a form of madness? Fewer than 2% of serial killers are found insane. So what creates from the boy next door an individual whose every waking thought is murder? This program builds a model developed at California State University which demonstrates the complex interaction of forces which led Jeffrey Dahmer and others who've lived amongst us to kill and kill again.
We know that everybody in the world has a capability of killing another person. Anybody can pull the trigger on a gun, poison somebody, push somebody off a cliff. We all physically can do these things, but not everybody has the capacity to kill. And that capacity is developed through a process.
So I go down and make the coffee mixture with Irish cream in it. Standard 7 pills. And drug him. Half hour later he falls asleep and I strangle him there in bed. You know, I mean, people can say, well, it was family pressures or it was outside forces or it was mental disease, but the fact is that I'm the one that did it, not just once, but time after time. Very self-destructive life.
The process which made Jeffrey Dahmer a serial killer is shown in our model. Many of us might experience one or more than one of the individual factors, but it's only very rarely when all these factors are combined that a truly dangerous individual is produced. The first important factor which our model indicates is that some of us may be born with genes that predispose us towards violence. The world's largest study of identical twins who've been separated at birth is showing which parts of our behavior are genetic and which parts are caused by our environment.
One thing that we find is that the identical twins, separated in infancy and reared apart, turn out to be just as alike, not only in their appearance, but in their personality, in their interests, in even in some of their social attitudes, as identical twins who have been reared together and spent most of their lives together. We know that the degree of aggressiveness that a boy child will show beginning early in life and continuing on through life owes about half, 50% of its variation to genetic variation. It's probably related to the level of circulating male hormone in the blood, which in turn is related to genetic factors. We know that the degree of fearfulness or fearlessness that people show also owes at least 50% of its variation to genetic factors.
Genetic factors play a role, but there are other physical factors like brain damage, which can also predispose people towards violent behavior.
Well, it's just a little neuroanatomy to begin with. Here are the front of the frontal lobes, and here are the front of the temporal lobes. And in the middle part of the temporal lobes is the hippocampus. Hippocampal gyrus is just inside there, and that is part of the so-called limbic system. limbic system is the anatomic locus, and this is somewhat oversimplified, of instincts, drives, feelings of sexuality, aggression, and the frontal lobes are supposedly mainly inhibiting and tend to inhibit those instincts and drives. Now, the brain has a consistency of jelly, and the skull, of course, is very hard. And when there is head trauma, the jelly-like brain goes cracking up against the skull. The MRI scan shows the brain. This is of a murderer who had killed 2 people in a particularly brutal fashion, having overkilled them, stabbed them 100 times each. He had been involved in a horrendous automobile accident at age 16 and had been in an intensive care unit for several weeks and had been unconscious for several days. His family said that his personality had changed somewhat and become much more explosive after that. And you can see that in the subcortical frontal white matter, there's an abnormality. There is this little spot, which seems white here. I would attribute this quite confidently to the trauma that he had sustained. He shows a lesion that's quite similar to it on the other side. And so this fellow has the equivalent of bifrontal leucotomies. His behavior was quite typical of people who have that. He was uncaring about the consequences of what he had done and was in fact uncaring about the execution which was impending.
As well as predisposing factors, a serial killer usually suffers traumatic events during childhood. Experiencing sexual and physical abuse will cause severe trauma. Other traumatic events are more commonplace. More than a third of children in the United States are brought up in broken homes, and many children experience feelings of neglect. It's only when traumas such as these are combined with other factors in our model that they might lead to deviant behavior, and in the most extreme cases perhaps to serial murder. Jeffrey Dahmer was brought up in an affluent Ohio community with many advantages. His father was a PhD research chemist, and the family home stood in 2 acres of woodland. What traumas might have affected this young child and aggravated a possible predisposition for violent behavior?
He remembered undergoing a surgical procedure when he was, I think it was either 4 or 5 years of age. And he recalled being in extreme pain and actually asking one of his parents whether or not his genitalia were still present given the pain that he was experiencing in the genital area. That had some significance to me because oftentimes people who have paraphilia will recall, and when I say paraphilia, I mean a deviant sexual interest pattern, will recall some form of pain or injury, in a sense, to their body.
Like many serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer also suffered traumas which intensified his deviant tendencies. His mother had a series of nervous attacks and a breakdown. His father was often away working, and the marriage was destined to end before Jeffrey grew up and left home.
It just didn't seem like my parents really liked each other too much. Arguments, fighting, it just made me feel on edge, unsure of the solidity of the family. I know she was in the hospital for about a month. A mental, ward. And Dad was busy working. I decided early I wasn't ever going to get married, because I wouldn't want to go through anything like that.
Certainly he did come from, by many folks' standard, a privileged background. It was a family that was well educated, that put a value in education. It was, by many standards, an industrious family. But as he recollected his childhood, there were long periods of time of emotional isolation, of him being unable to bond with other people.
Most of us have had traumatizing experiences as children. We grow up, we become ordinary citizens. And yet there are some children who have traumatizing events. Divorce in their family, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, physical abuse, dysfunctional families, alcoholism in the family. And they grow up and they become serial killers. And there's a quantum leap between somebody who is raised in a dysfunctional family and then growing up and becoming a serial killer.
In some cases, trauma leads to a process of so-called dissociation. The child defends himself by suppressing all emotional feelings towards family and friends.
Maybe I started shutting down to save myself the pain of what was going on. It was effective. It worked. Ever since then, I've never been a real emotional person.
What else could have aggravated Jeffrey Dahmer's feelings of isolation?
The boys that he tried to associate somewhat did not accept him fully. And I would also say that from time to time they would tease him and somewhat make fun and ridicule him.
He always seemed pretty nice to me, like he didn't make fun of nobody, and he wasn't, you know, like a lot of high school kids are cruel, just go out of his way to pick on people, or I don't think he was too popular, so I don't think nobody really liked him. He's kind of what they call nowadays a nerd.
When the child has become dissociated from the world which he feels has rejected him, it reinforces his trauma, and he begins to develop fantasies of an imaginary world in which he's powerful and in control. These comforting fantasies become the most significant factor in the child's subsequent development.
It's hard to be a child, and people pick on children, and other kids are merciless. And so children develop various defensive strategies. One is to fantasize the power to retaliate against one's enemies. Hopefully, as the child matures, he acquires better coping mechanisms that don't rely on impossible fantasies to achieve an adaptation. In Dahmer's case, he did develop better coping strategies from time to time, but also some that were far more deleterious, because he did in fact learn how to control other people, not because they'd been mean to him, but to serve a sexual need that he'd acquired. I don't think it's abnormal for a child to have fantasies of being able to zap his enemies. I think it's abnormal to carry those fantasies into adulthood.
For people who cannot deal with their own inner struggles, their own inner monsters, if you will, those own feelings, the feelings of low self-esteem, the feelings of hurt and pain, those feelings will fuel those fantasies, so you're fantasizing more and more. And as you fantasize more, the fantasies become more violent, more specific,